like to call this hearing to order. We want to thank the Secretary for coming. I'd like to recognize myself for the 5-minute opening statement. Today we review the Department of Energy strategy for management and disposal of used nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. We are pleased to have Secretary Moniz with us, looking forward to hearing his testimony. In 2008, after decades of research, DOE filed a 8,700-page license application at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for permission to construct a repository at Yucca Mountain. In 2009, the administration unilaterally decided to cancel the Yucca Mountain program and sought to withdraw the license application. The NRC, which is mandated under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to review the license, denied DOE's request, but not before the then NRC chairman directed the staff to cease its review, an affair this committee investigated at length. The matter of whether the NRC should resume its review, of course, has now been pending for quite some time before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. 3 weeks ago, 335 members of the House, including more than half of my Democrat friends, voted to preserve funding for the NRC's Yucca Mountain license review in the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill. This vote showed a remarkable bipartisan agreement that the NRC should continue its work as an independent safety regulator and issue a decision on whether or not Yucca Mountain would be a safe repository. After over 30 years and $15 billion, the American people deserve to know the NRC's independent, objective conclusion. And, Mr. Secretary, I would also just add that regardless of what results are, this scientific research at the conclusion would be helpful for any reason, any future repository. The research developed on Yucca Mountain and finalizing the scientific research would be helpful as we moved in other directions if we were to do that. So it's very important to finish the scientific report. In light of all this, DOE's new waste strategy very much represents the administration's effort to start from scratch, as if the Nuclear Waste Policy Act doesn't exist, or at least as if most of it doesn't exist. At the end of June, I sent a letter to the agency asking basic questions about the legal authority and funding for the actions DOE is currently undertaking. At this time, I'd like to ask that my letter, together with DOE's response and attachment, be included in the hearing record. Without objection, so ordered. DOE's response cited a few convenient sections of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act as providing the authority for the department to conduct certain work. But, and I want to underscore this, the agency did not cite Section 302D regarding the use of the Nuclear Waste Fund, which states, and I quote, "No amount may be expended by the Secretary under this subtitle for the construction or expansion of any facility unless such construction or expansion is expressly authorized by this or subsequent legislation. The Secretary hereby is authorized to construct one repository and one test and evaluation facility, which of course, with the law, is Yucca Mountain." DOE estimates the cost of starting over to be $5.6 billion for just the first 10 years. At the end of those 10 years, DOE projects to have only a pilot facility operating, with a repository not expected to be operational until 2048. Ladies and gentlemen, that's 65 years after Congress first passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and after the reactors we have operating today have most likely closed. DOE's strategy would require legislation, but Secretary Moniz indicated in our hearing last month that the administration did not intend to propose legislation. DOE is in this situation because the White House decided not to follow the law that Congress has already passed. With this strategy, DOE expects to simply write off $15 billion in favor of a pilot facility that might or may not get cited after this administration ends. I firmly believe the public deserves to know the truth about Yucca Mountain. We all need to know about all the money that's been spent and the science behind it, not just for ourselves, but for our children and our grandchildren. We deserve a permanent solution, not just the hope of a temporary fix. And with this, I'd like to yield now to my colleague, Mr. Tonko, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Secretary Moniz. Thank you for appearing before this subcommittee on a very important topic here this afternoon. For decades, nuclear power plants have provided electricity through the fleet of reactors located across our country. Over that same period, we have generated substantial amounts of waste that have yet to be secured in a long-term storage facility. We have debated this issue. We've funded research and development. We've passed laws designating a storage facility and have held numerous oversight hearings over the years. There have been reports by the National Academy of Sciences, the Government Accountability Office, industry and non-governmental groups, and then most recently, as we all know, the President's Blue Ribbon Commission. But we still have not solved the nuclear waste problem. We have a long-term storage facility, and yet we do not. We do not have interim storage facilities or a policy of establishing them, and yet we do. I don't know what else you would call the storage facilities at each of the power plant sites around the country. They are now de facto interim storage facilities. If nuclear power is going to continue to play a significant role in delivering baseload electrical power, we need a resolution to this situation. It will not be easy, and it will be, most likely, expensive. But the alternative is also expensive and provides less safety, less security than a functioning, ordered process for dealing with spent fuel. I realize that many people feel this resolution is to complete the process to open Yucca Mountain. Well, the Yucca Mountain facility is not open at this time, and it does not appear it will be open in the near future. In the meantime, spent fuel continues to accumulate and penalty fees continue to accrue. It appears to me that it is worth examining alternatives to current law and the current situation. Partisan bickering will not solve this situation, and strictly adhering to past or current positions will not solve this problem either. The the administration's strategy, based on the work done by the Blue Ribbon Commission in 2012, also has its challenges and its unknowns. If we are to pursue a system that includes both interim and long-term storage of waste, how do we proceed? How many interim sites will be needed? How much waste can or should be stored there, and what time period qualifies as interim? Where will they be located? How do we ensure that transportation to these sites is done and done safely? Are there states and localities willing to host repositories, either interim or permanent? What are the costs, and can we access the necessary funds through the fund established to deal with this problem? I do not expect to hear definitive answers to all of these questions here this afternoon. Today's hearing does, however, give us an opportunity to examine all options for moving forward. In any case, it appears congressional action is needed, and I'm willing to work with my colleagues to address this issue. I do not see much future for nuclear power if we do not find a way to deal with this issue. Again, Mr. Secretary, I thank you for being here this afternoon, and I thank you, Chairman Shimkus, for holding this very important hearing. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and certainly for your leadership on the issue. And Secretary Moniz, we certainly appreciate you being here as well this afternoon. During your tenure as Secretary, you and I will work together on a wide array of issues, and I certainly appreciate the time that we've spent since you've been Secretary and look forward down the road as well. I appreciate that dialogue on a number of issues. But certainly the nuclear waste disposal is a great concern for me, and one that I sank my teeth into early on when I came onto this committee as myself and Mr. Towns, really at Mr. Dingell's help. We were able to broker a pretty good deal back in the 90s. You know, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act is the law on the subject, and as Chairman Shimkus stated, that means Yucca Mountain. Shutting down the repository program, the administration did not elaborate on a technical or safety concern, merely that it was unworkable. This was followed by the former Nuclear Regulatory Commission chair, who unilaterally ceased the staff's review of the license application one month before a key safety evaluation report was to be publicly released with the agency's conclusion about the safety of Yucca. Electricity consumers pay for the disposal of civilian spent nuclear fuel, and taxpayers pay for disposal of nuclear waste from the Atomic Energy Defense Program. In Michigan, our consumers alone have paid nearly $600 million into the fund. $15 billion was invested in this program and got us within just a month of knowing whether we have a scientifically safe and sound location. And after spending that $15 billion, the public certainly should have the right to know what the NRC concluded. Instead, the strategy unfortunately abandoned that investment, expecting consumers and taxpayers to foot the bill for another $5.6 billion for the first 10 years to start really back at square one. By the end of this fiscal year, DOE will have spent nearly $80 million in support of that strategy. And I realize that it's the result of an omnibus appropriation for fiscal year 12 and a continuing resolution for 13, and I strongly support the efforts of the House Appropriations Committee to correct the situation. The House Energy and Water Appropriation Bill did clarify that the Nuclear Waste Fund is only to be used for its intended purpose, Yucca Mountain. The bill also eliminated the burden currently shouldered by the taxpayer for the administration's decision to start over. So questions have arise about whether the Nuclear Waste Fund would be adequate under DOE's new approach. GAO doesn't believe it is. Previous cost estimates indicated that the fund would be adequate to finish building and operating Yucca, but GAO questions whether the fund would be adequate to cover the costs of pursuing an alternative repository, in addition to 2 interim storage facilities and multiple transportation campaigns. The administration touts its strategy as saving taxpayer money by mitigating DOE's liability for failure to accept and dispose of spent fuel, and we've asked the GAO to analyze that. Last August, a year ago, GAO said that Yucca could be completed faster than a new effort to build interim storage, thus making Yucca the best option for mitigating taxpayer liability. I certainly remain committed to ensuring that consumers get the repository that they have paid for, and that the costs to the taxpayers are minimized. And right now, it seems as though Yucca does remain the clear answer to both of those problems, and it is the law. So, Mr. Secretary, I look forward to our continued dialogue in the weeks and months ahead to solve a long-term nuclear waste disposal issue. I yield back my time to...
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, in 1982, Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. The act sought to establish a fair and science-based process for selecting 2 repository sites for spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. Under this approach, no one state or locality would bear the entire burden of the nation's nuclear waste. In the years that followed, the Department of Energy began evaluating a number of potential repository sites. Then just 5 years later, in 1987, Congress made the decision to designate Yucca Mountain in Nevada as the sole site to be considered for a permanent geologic repository. There was no plan B. This decision was widely viewed as political and provoked strong opposition in Nevada. Ever since Congress decided to short-circuit the site selection process, the state of Nevada and a majority of its citizens have opposed the Yucca Mountain project. In 2002, President Bush recommended the Yucca Mountain site to Congress. Using the state veto procedures set forth in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, Nevada then filed an official notice of disapproval of the site. Congress proceeded to override Nevada's veto by enacting a resolution that was reported by this committee. 25 years after the 1987 amendments to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, it is clear that this Washington knows best approach has not worked. The Department of Energy has terminated its Yucca Mountain activities. President Obama wisely sought a new approach. He directed Secretary Chu to charter a blue ribbon commission to perform a comprehensive review of U.S. policies for managing nuclear waste and to recommend a new strategy. Last year, we heard testimony from the co-chairs of the Blue Ribbon Commission on the recommendations that resulted from their two-year effort. Since then, the Department of Energy has released a strategy for implementing many of those recommendations. The Commission recommendations and the DOE strategy deserve our serious consideration. They raise a number of important policy questions, such as whether a new organization should be established to address the nuclear waste problem, how nuclear waste fees should be used, and whether one or more centralized storage facilities should be developed in addition to one or more geologic repositories. These are policy questions that require a legislative response. Answering these questions requires an open mind and a willingness to move past a narrow obsession with Yucca Mountain. The Senate appears to be moving forward. 4 senators recently introduced bipartisan nuclear waste legislation. The bill may not have the final answer to every question, but it represents a genuine effort to get past ideology and begin grappling with these tough issues. We should seek a similar constructive approach in the House. If we pound the same old drumbeat on Yucca Mountain, all we will get is more gridlock, which serves no one well. Secretary Moniz, you do us a great service by appearing today before this subcommittee. It's unusual to have a department secretary testify before this subcommittee. We've had cabinet officials that testify before the full committee. It's a testament to your commitment on this issue. You were on that Blue Ribbon Commission and are a true expert on nuclear waste disposal. We should all listen very carefully to what you have to tell us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to the testimony of the Secretary.
And I thank my colleague, gentleman Niels Beckett's time, and I just want to reiterate, I agree with the ranking member that we do appreciate you coming here. We know it's extraordinary for a secretary to come to the lowly subcommittee, but we are pleased to have you. And with that, I'd like to recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I will start by disputing your characterization as lowly. I think, actually I would say, as you both have said, it may be a bit unusual, but I really appreciate the chance to come here and to start a dialogue on an important issue. As you know, I've been working on this issue, thinking about this issue for a long time, and I come here in a sense of hopefully we can pragmatically find a path forward. So Chairman Shimkus and Upton, ranking members Tonko and Waxman, members of the committee. So thank you again for inviting me here to discuss nuclear waste issues and the activities that the administration is ongoing to meet the challenge of managing and disposing of used nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. As was stated in January of this year, the administration, the Department of Energy, released its strategy for the management and disposal of used nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste based on the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission, on which, again, I did have the pleasure of serving under the leadership of Lee Hamilton and Brent Scowcroft. The administration clearly embraces the principles of the Commission's core recommendations, supports the goal of establishing a new workable long-term solution for nuclear waste management. I'd also like to observe, as was noted, that a bipartisan group of senators has introduced a bill adopting the principles of the Blue Ribbon Commission. I testified before that Senate Energy Committee yesterday and was encouraged by the progress they have made towards addressing the most complex of issues. And I appear today before this committee to reinforce that the administration is ready and willing to engage with both chambers of Congress to move forward. Any workable solution for the final disposition of used fuel and nuclear waste must be based not only on sound science, but also on achieving public acceptance at the local and state and tribal levels. When this administration took office, the timeline for opening Yucca Mountain had already been pushed back by 2 decades, stalled by public protest and legal opposition, with no end in sight. It was clear the stalemate could continue indefinitely. Rather than continuing to spend billions of dollars more on a project that faces such strong opposition, the administration believes a pathway similar to that the Blue Ribbon Commission laid out a consent-based solution for the long-term management of our used fuel and nuclear waste is one that meets the country's national energy security needs, has the potential to gain the necessary public acceptance, and can scale to accommodate the increased needs of a future that includes expanded nuclear power deployment. The strategy lays out plans to implement, with the appropriate authorizations from Congress, and we do need those authorizations, a long-term program that begins operations of a pilot interim storage facility, advances toward the siting and licensing of a larger interim storage facility, and makes demonstrable progress on the siting and characterization of repository sites to facilitate the availability of one or more geological repositories. Certainly, consolidated storage is a critical component of an overall used fuel and waste management system and offers a number of benefits, such as offering an opportunity to remove fuel from shutdown reactors, meeting waste acceptance obligations of the federal government sooner, and reducing the government's liabilities caused by delayed waste acceptance. No matter how many facilities or what specific form they take, we believe a consent-based approach to siting is critical to success. The administration supports working with Congress to develop a consent-based process that is transparent, adaptive, and technically sound as recommended by the Commission. The Commission emphasized that flexibility, patience, responsiveness, and a heavy emphasis on consultation and cooperation will all be necessary in the siting process and in all aspects of implementation. The strategy also highlights the need for a new waste management and disposal organization to provide the stability, focus, and credibility to build public trust and confidence. Again, there are multiple models that exist along a continuum from a government program to federal corporations. But whatever form the new entity takes, organizational stability, an appropriate level of autonomy, leadership continuity, oversight and accountability, and public credibility are all critical attributes for future success. Finally, the Department has also initiated the Blue Ribbon Commission recommended revisiting of the decision to commingle commercial used fuel and defense waste. So we are facing a unique opportunity to address the needs of the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle by setting it on a sustainable path and providing the flexibility needed to engage potential host communities and anticipate advancements in technology. We need to move forward with tangible progress toward used fuel acceptance, initially from closed reactor sites, and providing more certainty to the nuclear industry. This progress is critical to assure that the benefits of nuclear power are available to current and future generations. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Now I'd like to recognize myself 5 minutes for the first round of questions. Mr. Secretary, DOE strategy is built on the premise that states will volunteer to host interim storage or a repository facility. Your testimony mentions reports that, and I'm quoting your testimony, a number of communities are exploring the possibility of hosting a consolidated storage facility. So the question is, what states have indicated interest in hosting a facility?
First, I want to clarify, Mr. Chairman, that, of course, at this stage, we are not engaging in any kind of negotiations or anything of that type. However, there have been a number of public reports, and in fact, one county has, in fact, passed a resolution expressing interest. Based also upon the experiences in Europe, we believe there are reasons for optimism that we can have.
So we don't have states that have shown interest right now, nor do we have governors or U.S. senators who are making a pitch for their state to be considered.
Well, it's certainly premature for any so-called pitch, because right now we don't have even the authorities to move forward.
Well, no, it's not unlikely with the Blue Ribbon Commission and with the statements by this administration for states to have come forward and tried to organize their own political support with the governor's office and their sitting senators to be making this pitch that we would consider it. I mean, there's nothing in law that says they can't start trying to mobilize public support in their state for following up on this proposal, is there?
Well, no, and again, as I've said, there have been certainly reports in the media.
But you can't tell us of any states which have done that initial work. other than this one county and some state?
Well, one county that's in Texas. I mean, it was public. A public resolution was passed. Recently, there were media reports, which I have not attempted to any way confirm, but they were statements made in Mississippi. There have been a number of statements made. But again, until we have the authorities can put out a request for proposals, and I think, frankly, our position to provide some technical support for developing the information for potential communities, I think it would be premature, frankly.
It seems to me that a majority of these siting efforts end up with local communities supporting a facility, maybe this county, and state-level officials opposing it. In fact, if I remember, the history of Yucca Mountain was the State General Assembly passed a resolution in support of the initial siting of Yucca Mountain. So we also have, you know, Nye County versus Nevada, private fuel storage versus Utah, and your your written testimony mentions consent-based areas that might be successful, i.e. Sweden and Finland, but you fail to mention England, a consent-based approach that the Blue Ribbon Commission touted. And what happened to that consent-based approach?
These are tortuous paths, and
so it was not successful
and I think we will.
So I mean, my point is, what makes you believe that another consent-based approach somewhere in this country is not going to end up 30 years later in $15 billion in the hole, just like we have right now at Yucca Mountain?
Well, again, I think look, we all know all of these issues around nuclear waste take time. One example that, you know, it's not a high-level waste repository, but
which is a lot different than what we're talking about.
But in WIP, with the Transuranic facility, we did have a similar situation with the state, and now we have a very successful.
But I have a personal knowledge of a U.S. senator who fought against that as the Attorney General, who's now a sitting U.S. senator from that state. So
yes.
We better be careful. I think this illusion that this consent-based approach is going to be panacea, I'm not sure is supported by the facts. Another thing that the Blue Ribbon Commission that you're also promoting is that incentives are a key to success. And the estimated cost of this effort is, from the beginning, is $5.6 billion over 10 years. Why not offer this money to Nevada?
Again, the recommendation is around a consent-based approach. Any state and community can come forward.
So the state of Nevada, I mean, the issue would be, part of the problem with the state of Nevada is they say, show me the money. We don't believe you'll follow through, and there's not going to be any additional benefits. Wouldn't $5.6 billion to a state that has a struggling economy, that could rebuild its roads, bring in rail lines, and probably continue to do what we have and the Department of Energy has done with UNLV, continue to support their advanced nuclear energy technology, don't you think that would be a good lure?
Again, we are advocating a consent-based approach. Any state can come forward, and we do believe that research, materials testing, characterization facilities are an important part of a storage program, and would be part, and presumably would be part of a possible, quotes, incentive program.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Now I yield to Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the last few decades, the nuclear waste problem has been intractable. I think the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations and the Department of Energy's strategy document are helping to strike up conversation about where we go from here. Congress has an important role to play in finding solutions along with the departments and the Commission. Secretary Moniz, the Blue Ribbon Commission recommended a consent-based siting process for one or more centralized interim storage facilities and one or more permanent repositories. My understanding is that under current law, the only repository site that can legally be considered is Yucca Mountain, and interim centralized storage is not an option in the absence of Yucca. Is that correct?
I believe that's a correct reading of the...
So legislation would be necessary to establish a new siting process that ensures a project has the consent of the state and local governments?
Yes, sir. In fact, the Blue Ribbon Commission noted that almost all of the major steps require new statutory authorities.
Okay, thank you. The Blue Ribbon Commission recommended that a new organization be created to manage and dispose of the nation's nuclear waste. That's contemplated in the DOE strategy, too. Would congressional action be needed to establish an independent agency and transfer the necessary functions and resources to that agency?
Yes, sir, it would be.
There are also tricky funding and appropriations issues that need to be addressed to make sure that the funds put aside for constructing a repository or storage facility can actually be used for that purpose. Congress would need to address those issues through legislation, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. And again, if I may comment, we emphasized in the Commission, and it's also true in the administration strategy, that what's most important is that whatever form the organization takes, it has the proper authorities. Key among those is a proper access to the funds.
Thank you. And it sounds to me like DOE has taken an important step in developing a strategy, but you can't solve this problem alone, can you?
Correct, sir.
So there is a bipartisan effort in the Senate to develop legislation to begin addressing these very tough issues. We haven't seen any effort on the House side, though. House Republicans seem unwilling to move past their fixation on Yucca Mountain. So my question would be, while the Republicans seem to be waiting for a resolution to a pending lawsuit seeking to require the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to continue its work on the withdrawn DOE license application for Yucca, but a court opinion can't fix the funding problems or establish a new organization to handle the waste or end the staunch opposition to Yucca in Nevada, can it?
That's correct, and I would just add that again, our view is that quite independent of the court decision, we should have these parallel tracks of storage and repository development, and for that we will need the new authorities.
Mr. Secretary, what message would you share with members of the subcommittee and the broader committee who remain focused exclusively on Yucca Mountain?
Well, again, our view is that we've obviously been having a stalemate over Yucca Mountain. There's a very good chance this may continue for some time. There are many steps needed. Even if the court were to rule for the NRC to proceed, there are still other actions of Congress, many actions in the state, et cetera. And again, our main message is that will work out one way or the other, but let's move together on taking some practical steps that require new authorities, that will move the ball forward, provide more confidence to industry, and start getting the government accepting waste in the earliest possible time.
What's the perceived timeline here if we're to move forward and end with the ultimate goal of having a new repository available? Is there a certain given timeline that you can imagine would be required at minimum?
Well, again, the administration strategy noted that we feel that we can certainly move, if we have authority, let's say this year, then we could move on the first interim storage site within a decade. That would allow us, for example, to move fuel away from the closed reactor sites, which would be, I think, an important step, but that a repository is likely to take decades to actually get functioning.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank my colleague. I'll just remind him on the vote on the floor, 335 voting for Yucca, 118 Democrats, so it's just not a Republican fixation. Now I would like to yield to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, I really appreciate, Mr. Secretary, you being here and sharing your comments. This is such an important issue for the country, and you're right, we don't want gridlock on this. I would note it's been bipartisan in terms of trying to move a path forward for a couple of decades, actually, and certainly your willingness to engage and to move the ball forward is very much appreciated. And as Mr. Shimkus just said, in the votes that we've had the last couple of years, not only this year, but last year, the votes 326 to 81, 335 to 81, 337 to 87 is a pretty clear indication that the House, at least, has a very strong bipartisan majority towards trying to get this issue resolved. I would note that Mr. Dingell and myself wrote an op-ed piece about a month ago or so, again urging the NRC, urging the court rather, to try and help resolve this and allow the NRC to move forward. But let me go back. When you testified before our committee in June, Chairman Shimkus asked if you were aware of any technical or scientific issues that would prevent Yucca from being a safe repository, and you responded at that time, quote, "This is an NRC decision ultimately to be taken." And I certainly agree. And the public debate would clearly benefit from the NRC completing the independent assessment of Yucca. Fortunately, we know that both the NRC and DOE do have the funds to support the completion of the NRC's safety evaluation report. However, we're all waiting for that D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Maybe it'll be coming this afternoon, who knows, which seems to be taking an inordinate amount of time compared to a number of other cases that they've had. One of the issues that concerns me is what the ultimate cost of DOE's new strategy would be to the consumers and the taxpayers. We know that in '09, the fee adequacy assessment showed that the fee was adequate to fund Yucca Mountain. However, I'm going to quote from DOE's secretarial determination of the adequacy of the nuclear waste fund fees in January of this year, before you were there, said the consent-based approach to facility siting set forth in the strategy makes it impossible to assign meaningful probabilities to any geologic medium, and by extension, any cost estimate. Those were their words. So, do you know whether the nuclear waste fund today will be adequate to pay for all the facilities contained in the DOE strategy?
Mr. Chairman, certainly my understanding of the revised analysis that was done in response to the court, it looked at, I may get this not quite, I think it was something like 42 different scenarios into the future, and found that with continuation of the 1 mil per kilowatt hour fee, that kind of rested kind of in the middle of the various scenarios. And so the argument was that at this stage, the 1 mil per kilowatt hour fee would seem to be an appropriate place to go, but there's considerable uncertainty of the lifetime costs depending upon which of those scenarios ends up being followed.
Do you know whether the nuclear waste fund could absorb the $9 billion write-off for abandoning Yucca?
Well, if one looks at the ensemble of the scenarios in that fee adequacy reassessment, the uncertainties of the spread was much, much larger than the amount that you've said. So that would again be in the uncertainties that we have today to be realized only over decades.
Yeah, so for us in Michigan, that 1/10 of a mil fee has meant $600 million in essence collected from Michigan ratepayers. And so if you know Michigan at all, we've got one plant no longer operating, the Big Rock plant. I have two in my district, two facilities that are currently operating, and they've both run out of room, so they're doing dry storage. And I know Mr. Dingell's got a facility in his district as well. So ultimately, we really do need this to be resolved and get on a glide path that can assure that there'll be one safe place, at least one safe place, for the high-level nuclear waste. And I appreciate your willingness to work with us and with our committee to ultimately get this thing done.
If I may comment, I think the situations that you've described are exactly what motivated the Blue Ribbon Commission discussions, that we feel that moving to an initial, and administration has agreed with this, that moving to an initial kind of fast-track pilot interim storage facility could handle the fuel from those shut-down reactors, and that would allow, restoration of that site to other activities. And of course, we know that a substantial fraction of the plants are running out of space, and that's where the consolidated storage site. The issue was fuel acceptance. I mean, that's the key issue for the plants, and this would allow us to start to move the fuel and both alleviate the issues at the plants and lower the liabilities for the government by beginning to move the fuel. So that's why, I mean, again, we think that a parallel track of the storage and repository or repositories will give us the flexibility and the adaptability to start moving and accept fuel in the next decade.
Yield back.
Chairman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Ranking Member Mr. Waxman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Moniz, thank you again for being here today to discuss the administration's strategy for managing the country's nuclear waste. Over the last 2 years, this not lowly but very important subcommittee has heard testimony from a number of witnesses on the nuclear waste issue, including testimony from the state of Nevada about why many Nevadans oppose Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Depository. Martin Malsh, testifying on behalf of the state of Nevada, told the committee, quote, opposition to the Yucca Mountain project in Nevada was not always a given, end quote. But Congress and federal agencies took several actions that destroyed the state's trust in the process and locked in opposition. I'd like to ask you a few questions about how to move beyond the Yucca Mountain stalemate and learn from our mistakes in Nevada. In your testimony, you say, quote, any workable solution for the final disposition of used fuel and nuclear waste must be based not only on sound science, but also on achieving public acceptance at the local, state, and tribal levels. Let's start with sound science, you say, is necessary. What are the key scientific questions that need to be answered to satisfy concerns about the safety of nuclear waste disposal?
Well, there are a number of scientific questions. Ultimately, it comes down to understanding the form of the waste package, its interaction with the host environment, and the potential for having some elements go into the environment and propagate over long periods of time. That's what is a very detailed analysis looking at both geology, hydrology, and the materials issues around the integrity of the package.
The state of Nevada and Clark County raised particular concerns about how EPA and other federal agencies set safety standards for Yucca Mountain, alleging that these standards were tailored to make sure Yucca met them. The state of Nevada told our committee that these changes, quote, utterly destroy the credibility of the program, end quote. How should EPA and other federal agencies approach the regulatory process to ensure that any safety standards are both sufficient and credible with concerned stakeholders?
Well, again, if I go back to the Blue Ribbon Commission recommendations, the Commission emphasized that what really needs to be set first are kind of generic safety standards before one starts tailoring to an individual site. So, again, we think that the way that the Yucca Mountain decision was made, raises this problem, as you've referred to many times, in terms of it was not a consent-based process, and that itself created conditions. It also had the effect of highly restricting what the department could do over many years in terms of exploring different geologies, and it basically did not have this approach, as I mentioned, where one sets generic safety standards that one then applies to various characterized local sites.
So it could apply to a number of multiple sites.
Yes.
Having updated generic standards will also support the efficient consideration as you
Yes.
look at
And then that would inform the regulatory process. And as we've all said, particularly when you look also, you know, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act also had a cap of 70,000 tons, and we know very well that even if there were no nuclear reactors built, we would be way past that amount. We have to look at the questions of other repositories, certainly be prepared for that possibility.
Now, no project will ever enjoy universal support, so how do you envision defining consent? In the case of Nevada, the Yucca Mountain project enjoys some local support but faces strong opposition from the state and key counties. What can the federal government do to win support of a host state that is wary of hosting a repository or interim storage facility, even if the facility enjoys local support?
Well, again, we believe, or at least I should say I believe, that ultimately it's a very iterative process based upon, as I said in my testimony, continuous open cooperation and consultation at all levels. As we said earlier, and I think it is an example, again, I will concede to the Chairman's point that clearly the WIPP facility in New Mexico is a transuranic waste facility, not high-level waste, but the fact is that was a case where it took many, many years. There was litigation involved to win the confidence and trust all along the chain of responsibility, and now, as a result, we are into, well, I think we're into now our second decade of a highly successful operation there.
So for Congress, the take-home message should be that we tackle this problem by ensuring that federal agencies or any new organization that has the authority it needs to implement a consent-based process that is transparent and rooted in science.
That ultimately is the overarching, most important recommendation of the Commission.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman, this time's expired. Chair now recognizes Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know we're having another hearing on high-level nuclear waste when members of the audience are already asleep.
Wake up.
I'm not going to name names, but it starts, his initials are DG. But, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. And when I was a young man, some members in the audience have heard me tell this story, but it was my job to brief the then Secretary of Energy on a proposed piece of legislation in the Department of Energy that came to be known as the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. And they felt that if an Aggie engineer could explain a bill to an oral surgeon, that we ought to be able to get it through the Congress. And we did. And who would have dreamed that in 2013 we would have the current Secretary of Energy debating yet again another way to find a path forward on storage of high-level nuclear waste. My good friend from Illinois, the subcommittee chairman, asked you a question about what states might compete if we adopted your consent-based approach, or the department's consent-based approach. I would postulate that my state of Texas might actually offer to compete. The county in West Texas, Loving County, has already passed a resolution at the county level and have been engaged in Austin with the governor and the Texas legislature. While it's never a given, certainly I think the state of Texas might adopt an approach where on a local option basis a county or an entity could compete for an interim storage facility. I also know that Yucca Mountain, we've spent $15 billion, and I think the subcommittee and the full committee chairman are absolutely correct in trying to get value for the taxpayer dollars and the ratepayer dollars that have been spent on that facility. Again, I would ask as a question, if we were to adopt through legislation, as you have at least suggested we might, a dual-track approach of an interim storage facility while we're waiting to license a permanent repository, that would not preclude Yucca Mountain being chosen as either the interim facility and or possibly the permanent repository. Is that not correct?
Yes, I would agree. We view these as two linked but independent pathways.
Okay. And I believe I'm correct that under current law, Yucca Mountain has been legally empowered to accept interim, to be an interim facility for storage. Is that not correct?
I would have to clarify that, Mr. Chairman Emeritus.
Well, I think I'm
Yeah,
correct.
okay, I will take
You
that.
know, I think lots of things, not all of them are correct, so maybe I'm wrong on that, but I believe
Well, when you were a practicing engineer and I was a practicing scientist, we were always correct.
You've talked in your testimony about a pending court case, and I think it's fair to say that the majority of the committee is very frustrated that the court should have ruled, has yet to rule. Do you have any indication when we might get a ruling on the legality of what the Obama administration did in shutting down the Yucca facility?
No, sir, I have no insight whatsoever as to when a ruling would come, but I do, I've assured the committee and as the administration has spoken that whatever the ruling is, we will act appropriately and help to carry it out.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to say in closing that I'm a strong supporter of Yucca. In your absence, I went to the floor week before last and opposed several amendments against Yucca, so I'm pro Yucca. But I don't want to have to serve as long as John Dingell has already served to finally find an answer to the high-level waste issue. And if we can adopt some sort of a dual approach where we push forward on licensing Yucca as the final repository while also letting states compete on an interim storage basis, I, for one, on the majority side, would be supportive of that approach with the appropriate safeguards and caveats about the money and the effort that's already been spent at Yucca Mountain. So I thank the Secretary and his department for their efforts, and I hope that since we this morning passed a SGR fix that nobody thought could happen, this could be 2 in a row. If we can pass a high-level waste bill out of this committee, that would be a tremendous accomplishment on your watch and Mr. Upton's watch and Mr. Tonka's and Mr. Waxman's watch. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time, and I can assure my colleague that as long as Yucca Mountain is still in the mix, we can move forward. But I have no indication that the administration wants to move forward on Yucca Mountain. So now I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes.
For your courtesy, and I commend you for having this hearing. Welcome, Mr. Secretary, to the committee. I note here in 2006 you wrote an article supporting Yucca Mountain. In 2011 you wrote another article saying there needs to be an alternative. So to assist the committee with our judgments here, do you now believe that Yucca Mountain is no longer an option as a permanent repository? Please answer yes or no.
Congressman Dingell, with all due respect, I need to add a little bit more than yes and no. I would note that the article you referred to, actually it's an op-ed, I think, in 2006, did say that DOE had to take a fresh look at assessing the suitability of Yucca Mountain. It was not exactly a complete
What does that mean,
endorsement.
Mr. Secretary, that you think it's still a viable thing?
Well, again,
or that it is not?
The view is that it needs both science and public acceptance. The latter is not there, and we are not seeing an end to the stalemate.
With all respect, Mr. Secretary, you've taken both sides of this issue. We've shot about $12 billion, as near as I can figure, maybe 13 now. And the hole is still there. People are digging and doing things, but nothing is happening. And we don't have any idea when we're going to complete this problem or anything else. Now, Mr. Secretary, would you please provide additional information for the record regarding the viability of Yucca Mountain as a permanent repository? And I'll let you come up with whatever it is you feel you should like to say on that particular matter.
Yes, sir, we will.
Now, Mr. Secretary, do you have any plans to reinitiate DOE's license application to the NRC for review and final decision on Yucca Mountain? Yes or no?
No, but again, if the court reinstates the NRC licensing process, then we will support it as needed, assuming we have the funds to do so.
Now, Mr. Secretary, the Blue Ribbon Commission, of which you were a member, was not allowed to examine Yucca Mountain as a part of its study. Do you believe that doing a similar study, but again, but including Yucca Mountain would be useful to the administration as it determines a path forward regarding nuclear waste storage? Please answer yes or no.
No, sir, I don't think that would be useful at this time. A commission like the Blue Ribbon Commission was very important to address the generic, non-site specific issues as we discussed. For example, one of the problems is the need to get generic safety criteria before one starts moving into the consent.
So is the answer, Mr. Secretary, yes
it was
or no?
no. It was no. Yes.
Pardon?
Sorry?
Yes or no?
It was a no. Yes.
Okay. Now, Mr. Secretary, amongst BRC's recommendations is a consent-based approach where localities across the country could volunteer to be the site of a new repository. Under the best-case scenario, where all the units of government from local to state to federal agree that there is a site that meets the needs of a repository of this kind, how long approximately would it take to create such a repository, and how much would it cost?
Well, I think the estimates based upon the fee adequacy assessment were approximately $3 billion for pre-selection site evaluation for a repository, and approximately 8 to 9 for site characterization and licensing. So it altogether in the $10 billion, $11 billion range.
Would you submit for the record your further comments on that, on both of those two matters? How long and how much?
We'd be pleased to.
Now, Mr. Secretary, the BRC report recommends, and I quote, access to the funds nuclear utility ratepayers are providing for the purpose of nuclear waste management. And you propose non-legislative as well as legislative changes to achieve this goal. Can access to the funds be gained through non-legislative means, yes or no?
I would say yes and no. We strongly feel that legislation really is the appropriate way to go. I think the principal administration's proposal and really the commission's is somehow we need to have the funds, either the funds and the expenditures, either mandatory or discretionary, but in a way that does not have these funds competing with the other government priorities.
Would you submit further comments for the record? Now, Mr. Secretary, would non-legislative proposals recommend ways in which we could protect funds being deposited into the nuclear waste funds? As you note, we have dissipated large sums of money. Can you answer yes or no to that, please?
Again, we feel legislation is the appropriate route.
Now, Mr. Secretary, in the 2011 article I mentioned earlier, you note that you are a strong supporter of nuclear energy, developing new nuclear technologies and investing in other energy technologies. Based on recent appropriations and the recently passed energy and water appropriations from the House, do you believe that your department now has the resources to invest in these new technologies to prevent, as you put it, America being less competitive in the global technology market? Close quote. Please answer yes or no.
Well, if the president's request is respected, then the Nuclear Energy Office has a very good plan in place to both support advanced reactor technology and the technology development for waste disposal. I would add to that, of course, beyond the appropriated amounts, the department has made the conditional loan guarantee of $8 billion roughly to build first mover new nuclear plants, which is a critical issue for the future of nuclear power in this country.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I'm over my time, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, I thank you for being here. Sometimes it's not good to have been here before, like you have. The questions that you get put to you, but I well remember you on my my section 999, that you were very knowledgeable on that. And that's still up. And you remember we knew we had energy at a certain level, but we couldn't get it to the top of the water, and we traded for technology from the universities and others and paid them with the water the energy we did get to the top of the water. So we didn't get it if they didn't get it to the top. They got it to the top, and it's working, and they're still trying to kill 999. I hope you'll remember your position on that.
I remember your efforts very, very well, leading that charge, and I would say that as a fact, I think the result has been some excellent research.
It's still working.
Especially on the environmental footprint of unconventional oil and gas production.
And thank you. I have, and it is a pleasure to see you. I have a copy of a DOE presentation here from late June that indicates the size for the, quote, larger interim storage facility, unquote, the one slated to be opened in 2025, and the DOE strategy is 70,000 metric tons. Is that right? That's your...
Yes, sir.
I think that maybe is out of your testimony.
And that would be preceded by the pilot plant.
That's the entire inventory of what the nuclear industry is currently storing and the statutory size of Yucca Mountain, right? Mr. Secretary, how hard is the administration going to answer, or how are they going to make people believe when you say that that facility is going to be temporary?
Well, I think this is again the so-called linkage issue, and we think it's very important that the action on the storage side is accompanied in parallel by an adequate expenditures to establish one or more repositories.
How will DOE overcome the concerns that a lot of people are going to have on the part of communities that an interim site could become a de facto permanent site if no other community could be found to host a permanent disposal facility area?
Again, as I've said, I think this is going to be a long discussion, and we also noted that there should be flexibility into the system so that the individual communities and states who are stepping forward as potential hosts can negotiate the linkages that they feel are appropriate to lend them confidence.
The presentation also estimates, I don't know where it is there, but I think we've seen it somewhere, estimates transporting the spent fuel to this larger interim storage facility at a rate of 3,000 tons a year. And that means that it'd take over 23 years just to transport the spent fuel to the site. And by the time the 70,000 tons was all transported, it'd be 2048. That's a hard figure for me to think about, being here and being sure that it happens just that way.
Yes, well, it's a major logistical challenge, and I think no matter what repository, what storage sites one has, it's a major transportation campaign. I also served on a National Academy Committee several years ago looking at transportation, and a couple of things of note, perhaps. One is that we felt that for the large campaign, a heavy reliance on trains would be a good thing. That's a big planning project. Secondly, we also noted that the number of used fuel movements in Europe already is approximately equal to all the movements we would need for 70,000 tons, and that's been handled in a pretty safe way.
But 2/48 is the projected date for opening a repository under DOE's strategy.
It's approximate.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, does that really make sense?
Well, I think, I think
you've been around a long time.
I think the issue is,
you're very knowledgeable.
To be honest, the department has had an issue of perhaps too often providing optimistic dates for big projects, and maybe being a little more conservative is a good idea.
It's going to be hard to explain how they're going to spend 23 years transporting just to turn around and ship it all again. Isn't that going to cause some problems?
Well, of course, we in no way precluding the possibility of state
DOE
Gentleman's time's expired.
DOE estimated the transportation cost for 70,000 metric tons to go to Yucca at $19 billion. I'm anxious to watch what the analysis is going to be on that, and my time really is up.
Gentleman's time expired. I would remind him that if everything would have gone upon plan, the Yucca would have been open in 1998. Had the administration not pulled the plug when it did, we'd be under construction right now. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing. I want to thank Secretary Moniz for joining us. The subcommittee examined the issue of nuclear waste storage in numerous hearings for the past several years. In 2011, as ranking member of the subcommittee, I had the opportunity to visit Yucca Mountain with Chairman Shimkus, and I've supported the use of Yucca Mountain in the past and still believe it's a terrible waste of taxpayers' dollars to have this $12 billion facility sitting unused in the desert, although in all honesty, we're not going to sell that desert land for condos. And so I assume it'll stay in our federal land inventory, so maybe someday we have this hole in the ground, it could be used for long-term nuclear storage. The termination of the project, though, has postponed our nation's efforts and delayed efforts to permanently dispose of used nuclear fuel. It's now envisioned we'll be storing these materials in dry cask for decades, no longer much longer than the original intended purpose. What is DOE doing to support the long-term storage of used nuclear fuel in these dry cask storage systems? And I'll go forward after that. Is there any program in DOE to be able to deal with the amount of nuclear waste we're seeing?
Yes, sir. There is work going on, and also historically, we've had a collaboration with EPRI in terms of looking at the dry cask storage longevity, and the particular focus right now is on the materials issues, and really whether we can confidently expect century scale storage.
Between the 1980s and 2010, when Yucca Mountain was terminated, the nation invested billions of dollars in a scientific study at that site. The scope of this work spanned our entire national lab complex and many of our leading universities and a number of other respected institutions. What is the understanding of the results of this study, and what did we learn? How can we best apply the results of this work before going forward so that our investment is not wasted? You know, we know that, at least politically in the foreseeable future, Yucca Mountain's not available, but we still need to plan for long-term storage, and I think that's what the Blue Ribbon Commission said.
Well, may I answer? Oh, yes. For example, I would pick out a couple of areas. One would be that I think the methodology was developed for developing large-scale reservoir and, if you like, water basin modeling techniques that one will need in any geology to go forward. Another, I would say, is understanding how the form of waste package interacts with the environment. So I think the methodology for how one does characterization and waste package geochemistry interactions has been advanced.
So we have learned something from the effort. And as you know, and you served on, and thank you for your service, the Blue Ribbon Commission recommended a consent-based approach to repository siting. With respect to the Yucca Mountain project, there appears to be a division of the opinion. And having been out there, and I think we met with about every county official from around that area who very much supported it. Obviously, the state of Nevada and Clark County doesn't. And that may have been different back years ago when it was selected. How can we keep from having something, because these things take so long, getting permission, and there may be consent, but a decade later, all of a sudden, the political will is not there. And whether it be in, you know, I know there's a proposal for Pecos area of Texas and New Mexico. There may be other locations, but, you know, if we make a decision and the political will then changes, which is what seemed to happen out in Yucca Mountain, how did the Blue Ribbon Commission address that issue if we're going to look for consent now and expect that contract to last for decades?
Well, I think the Commission recognized that, well, first of all, again, let me repeat that in the case, again, transuranic repository in New Mexico, a little bit of a different animal, but that's a case where, again, it took an evolution of the community-state interaction. Secondly, with the commission recognized that each of these negotiations will be somewhat different, but in a generic sense, recommended a process that would have various steps and commitments to continue, which kind of ratcheted up at each step of the negotiation.
Let me, I know I'm almost out of time, and I won't have time for all my questions. Mr. Chairman, I know no country in the world has long-term storage, but our country is producing a lot of it, and I would think it'd be redundant to create a separate agency. I think we might need to fix the one we have, and so we don't add that bureaucratic delay into getting forward with it. But I thank you for the time.
Gentleman's time expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for taking your time to come visit with us on what is a very important and long-going issue. In 1980, Congress passed the Low-Level Waste Policy Act, providing a framework for states to voluntarily join compacts and then work within the compact to site a low-level waste disposal facility. While this merely addressed low-level waste, it provides relevant experience about a consent-based process for nuclear waste disposal. After the Act was passed in 1980, it wasn't until 1985 that Congress approved the compacts. And then it was 1990 before a disposal facility opened in Utah, but only for Class A waste, the lowest class of low-level waste. Congress didn't approve the Texas-Vermont compact until 1988, 18 years after the Act passed, and the disposal facility in Texas didn't open until 2011 after a 7-year licensing process. Today, 33 years after Congress passed the 1980 Act, 34 states still remain without access to low-level waste classes B and C disposal. So my question is, in light of the limited success and lengthy process for consent-based siting for low-level waste, what gives you confidence that DOE will find an interim storage site for used nuclear fuel and have it operating 8 years from now?
Well, first I would note that, first of all, there is some success, and again I go back to the WIP example in New Mexico, which is for transuranic waste, again, it took a long time. This goes back to, with Mr. Hall's question, we prefer to be conservative and said 2048 because these things take time, and I think we just have to start on that path. I personally remain optimistic that we will have communities coming forward and then provided technical assistance so that they can be certain that they have the technology base to move forward.
Well, given your role on the Blue Ribbon Committee, are you familiar with the private fuel storage project in Utah, which is the only interim storage facility ever licensed?
Am I familiar?
Are you familiar
yes,
with that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you know how long the NRC took to issue that license?
No, I do not, sir.
Okay, if I told you 8 years, would that surprise you?
No.
Okay, all right. Do you know the status of that license now?
No, I do not.
Okay, it's my understanding the consortium asked the NRC to terminate the license late last year.
I see. Mm-hmm.
So I think PFS is an example of how a local community, in this case, the Gashud Indians, initially supported a project, but state officials opposed it, just like the situation with Yucca Mountain. It's also an example of how licensing such a project is not as expedient as sometimes the DOE strategy suggests. So, you know, what we have here is a very serious issue. It is something that we have dealt with for now decades. I don't believe that the formation of a new federal agency to oversee management of nuclear waste is the answer. I believe that that would just create additional delay. So I would hope that we can continue to work on this issue, and I certainly want to thank you for your time today to come share this with us. And with that, I yield.
If the gentleman would yield.
Yes, I'll yield to the chair.
And I would just highlight, we did this when the Blue Ribbon Commission testified before us, and there's a map of Nevada. We talk about local interest. 2 points to this is that all the counties minus Clark have resolutions on record supporting Yucca Mountain. And then we talk about local issues, and you use, even in your testimony, Finland and Sweden. The land base of that siting proposal, which you would call local, you know who what would be local for Yucca Mountain? Who would be considered the local land owners? It would be the federal government. That's how far away and it's expansive federal property as Yucca, who is local, would be us. We're the local interest of concerns, and if we're not, the local communities that all have gone on resolutions in support of Yucca, they are on record. So, you know, I'm kind of getting tired of this bashing of the Nevadans, that they're all one side when there is a strong vocal group of Nevadans who want this, hence going back to the $5.6 billion that I think you should put on the table to help convince maybe the other folks from Nevada. So with that, I'd like to recognize my colleague from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary, for being here today and participating. And as you know, like it or not, nuclear waste is a reality. Part of that reality is that nuclear waste is going to be around for a long, long time, far beyond the lifetimes of our children and our grandchildren. But as the creators of this waste, I believe we have a responsibility to put in place a long-term plan to store it safely. And in the absence of such a plan, however, spent nuclear fuel will continue to be stored for the foreseeable future on site, right at nuclear power plants like Diablo Canyon, which is in my congressional district. I've been pleased to see more spent fuel being moved out of high-density pools and into dry cask storage at Diablo Canyon and also across the country. These casks are more stable and safer, but they are not a permanent solution for spent fuel storage, in my opinion. Do you agree?
Yeah, well, yes. As
They're not a
I've
permanent.
said, century scale looks to be the kind of scale.
Pardon?
That we think the dry cask storage for the order of 1 century.
1 century they'll work, but not a permanent. I mean, we can't.
Not a millennium.
Not a millennium.
Right.
As we all know, implementing a permanent storage solution has proven to be quite difficult. I commend the administration for moving the ball forward with the Blue Ribbon Commission report and the strategy released earlier this year. But given the serious challenges that still lie ahead, my constituents and I remain concerned that Diablo Canyon could become a de facto long-term storage site. It's already been over 30 years since Congress first directed the Department of Energy to remove and store spent fuel, nuclear fuel from power plants. So, Mr. Secretary, what happens if it takes another 30 years or even longer to implement a permanent storage plan? Does DOE have a contingency plan to handle long-term on-site storage of spent nuclear fuel?
Well, first, I think the general technical judgment is that continued on-site storage, moving in from pools to dry casks, is not, is a reasonably safe approach, but it's not the system that we want at all. And that's exactly why we feel that the strategy put out following the Commission's recommendations to aggressively pursue the parallel paths of consolidated storage and repositories is the right one. It gives flexibility, adaptability, and it won't be immediate. We think we have a chance to start moving some fuel in about 10 years, but only if we start now.
Right. So I'll just move ahead. One of the most important elements of the Blue Ribbon Commission report and DOE strategy is the consent-based approach for locating the permanent storage facility. Engaging local communities in this process is critical, especially for the consolidated facility, but it's also crucial to engage with the communities where the fuel is currently being stored and could be traveling through. I'm very concerned about the transportation. Once a permanent site is found, how do we move this spent fuel safely? This is a top priority for my constituents in San Luis Obispo. They have serious concerns about the risks involved in moving the spent fuel safely through their communities, and they want their voices heard in this process. So what extent is DOE engaging with communities where there is this storage now occurring and so many concerned constituents who are worried about how that transporting is going to happen through their communities?
So the department has done a number of, recently, a number of transportation studies, and again, I refer to the National Academy report of, I have 6 or 7 years ago. I was a member of that group as well, and again, I think 2 points, maybe one to reiterate, is that the amount of fuel movement called for all of the fuel we have today is very comparable to what Europe has already done with a very good safety record. However, clearly we have to, A, do it very well, but B, the report emphasized strongly the same thing as you've emphasized, the need to early on work with the communities along transit pathways, instruct in emergency response kinds of activities, communicate, know what's happening, and that's very important. So I think as soon as we understand that we are moving towards a system to begin moving that fuel, we need to get very aggressive in that community outreach.
Well, I appreciate knowing that. I share your concerns about it. And
the gentlelady's time's expired. And on her point, though, but I think in testimony yesterday, the Secretary said Plan B is to leave on site. That was testimony yesterday. If the Plan B right now,
well,
if all else fails.
But I said it's the ground truth. If we can't move
well, I'm just trying to lay out the facts as was testified yesterday. That Plan B would be
me as well.
keep on site. So that's their Plan B.
If I may clarify what I said again, the ground truth is if we can't move it, it stays where it is. It's a tautology. That's why we have to have the ability to move it.
Just trying to get some transparency here,
for that,
Secretary.
We need the authorities from Congress.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary. It's good to talk with you again. Thank you for being here with us today. Most of DOE's current nuclear waste management activities rely on taxpayer funding appropriated in 2012 and under the continuing resolution for 2013. This means that the taxpayer is currently funding the costs of DOE's effort to start over, breaking the historic principle that the beneficiaries of the electricity, the consumers, pay the costs of disposal. For how long and for what cost does the administration support continuing the policy of having the taxpayer foot the bill?
Well, sir, I think, first of all, let me refer to the letter to Mr. Shimkus that he had read into the record, looking at all the activities and the authorities, et cetera. This, by the way, has been reviewed by our General Counsel and by the Department of Justice to make sure all the authorities were proper in terms of what was used for appropriated funds and what was used by waste funds. But I think as you referred to the 2012 Consolidated Appropriations Act, there was explicit language to look at fuel management and disposal activities. In my view, those are very generic activities. Frankly, those are some of the activities that the Department was proscribed from doing by the 1987 actions, in my view, to be honest, very mistakenly, that this research on the back end of the fuel cycle was always important, and it's very important that we continue to do it now.
Okay. There have been, changing subjects a little bit, there have been inaccurate statements how Yucca Mountain can only hold 70,000 metric tons. So even if we build Yucca, we'll still need more than one repository. I'd like to clarify for the record that is a statutory, not a scientific limit. In the Yucca Mountain EIS, DOE analyzed, and I quote, the total projected inventory of commercial spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste, plus the inventories of commercial greater than Class C waste and DOE special performance assessment required waste. In DOE's 2008 report to Congress on the need for a second repository, DOE referenced studies of repository designs 3 times the area of the design used to accommodate the 70,000 metric tons, and an independent study that concluded Yucca Mountain could accommodate from 4 to 9 times the statutory limit. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to insert DOE's 2008 report into the hearing record.
Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, DOE's July 22nd response to Chairman Shimkus, I think as you indicated, indicates that ongoing transportation activities are authorized under Section 180 of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and eligible to be paid for from the Nuclear Waste Fund. However, Section 302 of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act regarding use of the Nuclear Waste Fund stipulates no amount may be expended by the Secretary under this subtitle for the construction or expansion of any facility unless such construction or expansion is expressly authorized by this or subsequent legislation. The Secretary is hereby authorized to construct one repository and one test and evaluation facility, which of course, as we know, is Yucca Mountain. So my question is, how does the department justify nuclear waste fund expenditures on transportation for destinations other than Yucca Mountain?
Well, sir, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, and I think I may have to get back to you for the record in detail.
Neither am I. So.
But, okay, well, then we talk the same language.
We do.
But I think, again, all of the entries in those three tables that were sent were reviewed by General Counsel at DOE. Secondly, I would note that, at least my understanding is, those transportation studies were very generic. They would be applicable anywhere, and they certainly are not applied to the construction or expansion of any facility. So I can check on that with the lawyers, but that would be my first reaction.
Yeah, I would ask you to go back and check, Mr. Secretary, because as I understand Section 302, it seems pretty emphatic and pretty specific what the shalls and the shall nots pertain to.
Okay.
Okay. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back time. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, first I want to thank you for bringing your technical expertise and your human communication skills to this difficult problem.
Thank you.
My first question would be, do you believe, in your opinion, that technology exists for safe transportation and long-term storage of high-level nuclear waste?
In the National Academy study that I referred to earlier, it certainly concluded that one has to execute, but yes, that it could be safe.
So what you've said is that we need both the science and we need the public acceptance for a local. So clearly in Yucca Mountain, the public acceptance part of this has failed. Would you be a critic and tell me what you think went wrong in that process in getting that project to be acceptable in Nevada at Yucca Mountain?
Well, I'm neither a lawyer nor a psychologist, right. But I think, as was said earlier, I think the very prescriptive nature and, frankly, the change of process that led to the singling out of Yucca Mountain, I think just inherently raised some opposition.
Do you think that that can be repaired, the damage?
Well, again, we feel that a consent-based process has a very good chance of being successful with the time taken to communicate, cooperate, and assist in technical analysis.
But at the very least, the department has learned from that experience and probably won't make those same mistakes again.
I think we've all learned a hard lesson, yes.
Good, thank you. I have another question. Do you believe that high-level waste has enough potential future value to design repositories that the waste could be retrieved in the future if appropriate?
Well, if I may just kind of make sure we have our definitions in the same aligned, we are using high-level waste generally to apply to things like the defense waste where the things like plutonium have already been removed, so they do not have energy value. But in the spent fuel, or used fuel as it's sometimes called, from the commercial power reactors, they still contain plutonium, which certainly could be used for power production. That is what is done in France, for example. I want to make very clear, I'm not advocating that, but technically that is correct. Retrievability, however, independent of that, is probably something that will be important for public acceptance, at least over some time period.
Well, if you look at what's happening at the NIF program in Livermore, in order to use the NIF as a gateway to a hybrid fusion reaction, a reactor, a commercial reactor, they would use spent fuel and use neutrons created in little fusion explosions to accelerate a heat-driven process, which would, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, there are many,
there are values in this material.
There are many alternatives. You're referring to a process called spallation, typically.
I didn't know the word.
To make neutrons that you then do something else with. There's fusion, there's conventional fusion, there's inertial confined fusion. These are all, shall we say, well into the future as possible energy sources, but they are being researched. Another thing I just maybe mention is that there's a concept that's interesting potentially, in which one uses fusion for the purpose of making neutrons that then makes more nuclear fuel using depleted fuel, and I think that's the thing that you're probably referring to.
So the other question I have has to do with the concern about commingling of military versus civilian nuclear waste. What's the issue there? I don't understand why that's a concern or an issue.
Well, in the 1980s, that decision was made to commingle them. That wasn't made in the context of the 1998 date, and so it was viewed that the defense programs could then be relieved of the need to independently develop a repository. Well, now it's a different world. 1998 is past, as far as I can recall. Also, since then, we have developed specific agreements with states, like Idaho, for example, in terms of removal of not only spent fuel, but of high-level waste. And so so we are not saying, or the Blue Ribbon Commission was not saying that technically one could not combine them, but it does note that there are very different issues, different agreements. Also, the high-level waste for the defense waste, so-called, as I said earlier, does not have energy value. Number two, it has different packaging. Number three, it typically was very low burn-up fuel. So it's typically much cooler than commercial waste. And so what we are doing, there's no judgment made, but we're going to reopen that, relook at the decision, and see if it would make more sense to keep them separate or keep them on the same track.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'd ask him to talk to me about Hanford on background. We can talk about it. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, again, thanks very much for being with us this afternoon. And if I could go back to Chairman Shimkus' June 28th letter that he had written to the Department of Energy, the chairman raised questions about the legal authority under which DOE is conducting the various nuclear waste activities. It looks to me that DOE is picking and choosing which laws are convenient to follow. In the nuclear fuel storage and transportation section of DOE's response, I noticed that DOE cites the Nuclear Waste Policy Act's Monitored Retrievable Storage, the MRS, provisions as the authority for pursuing interim storage activities. However, DOE's 2008 report to Congress on the demonstration of the interim storage of spent nuclear fuel from decommissioned nuclear power reactor sites states in Section 141 of the NWPA authorized the Department to site, construct, and operate a monitored retrievable storage MRS facility, but restricted the ability of the Department to pursue this option by linking any activity under the section to milestones tied to progress in the development of the Yucca Mountain repository. I guess the question I have then is, given that the DOE has shut down the Yucca Mountain program, how can DOE justify its activities on interim storage under the MRS provisions? Kind of a long question.
Again, sir, ultimately, I'm relying on the judgment of our General Counsel and Department of Justice and spelling out the authorities that were in there. And I'm also happy to respond more fully upon further research there. But again, in my view, the issues of researching for the whole back end of the fuel cycle, no matter what we pursue in terms of storage and repository programs, we need to do that work that frankly was suspended for so long because of the 1987 decision. But I will respond more. I will get a response.
Well, if I could ask, if you could respond to the committee in writing on that, I'd greatly appreciate it, because it's, I think that's a very important point out there that needs to be,
We'd be happy to.
considered and responded to. And if I could follow up on another point in regard to the chairman's letter, it also, DOE also indicated that the used fuel research and development activities are authorized under the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. And it's clear, however, that in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, amendments enacted into the 1987 law, Congress directed DOE not to conduct further repository research on sites other than Yucca Mountain. In its decision in the United States versus a state of Romani, the United States Supreme Court stated a specific policy embodied in a later statute should control our construction of the earlier statute, even though it has not been expressly amended. And the question I have then, Mr. Secretary, is how do you and then DOE justify ignoring the sections of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act while claiming to follow the others and then falling back to the Atomic Energy Act, which so clearly has been superseded by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act?
Again, sir, I will include that in the detailed response, because I'm just not the person to answer those legal questions.
Because again, you know, in reading your testimony, you know, I think it's very important, because especially as we've known that we're looking at about $15 billion has been spent at Yucca. And, you know, I think if I remember right in your testimony, we're talking that it's looking maybe another $19 billion is going to have to be expended because of having to find other places to deposit the nuclear waste. So that, if I'm reading that correctly, is that $15 billion and then another $19 billion on top of that?
Certainly north of 10, that's for sure.
So we're talking $34 billion out there that is going to be expended when we already had a site in Yucca. Is that correct?
Well, again, going back to the waste fee adequacy analysis, it's consistent that a mil per kilowatt hour would cover all of these costs. So it's essentially nuclear power, you know, pay as you go. And if I think the exact cost will become sharper only as the future trajectory becomes more clear. But the 1 mil per kilowatt hour in the revised assessment is certainly consistent with covering the costs.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask for indulgence to ask one more question.
Depends on how long.
Short.
I got colleagues who are wanting to ask.
When you say when it becomes sharper, in looking at that, could I just ask what's your definition of sharper when it comes? You said when those numbers become sharper.
First of all, the trajectory of nuclear power, which clearly is an unknown today, will it grow substantially? Will it not? Are we going to have multiple repositories? Are we going to have multiple storage sites and repositories at the same time? I think those are all issues that will have to be resolved to get the full life cycle cost understood.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Georgia. Your time has expired. You can't. No time to yield back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today. And I can't help but feel like you've been put in an incredibly difficult position. You didn't really get us here, but it's good to have a friend of nuclear in your position, even though you have got an impossible set of circumstances to deal with. I just want to ask you, explain it so an old county commissioner can understand it. What's it going to take? What's going to have to happen? And who's going to have to do what before we decide whether to go forward with Yucca or not?
Well, I think the initial issue will be the results of the current litigation with the NRC.
Lawsuits have got to be decided.
That has to be decided, and as we've said, I mean, we will.
And you need some legislative, and you need some legislative authority to do anything different than what's being litigated in the lawsuits right now.
Again, we feel that we should be pursuing these dual tracks in any event, and that will require new authorities. Should the licensing go forward, the evaluation go forward at the NRC, again, a caution that there are still many, many other steps that need to be taken by the Congress and the state to to have that project go forward. So,
Well, what should those steps look like? What should we be doing? In
well,
your
I think
opinion?
the first thing that I'm really asking for, and the administration asks for, is to have the authorities to move forward.
Well, here's
on
the
this
concern I've got.
parallel
Here's the concern
storage
I've-
track.
Here's a concern I've got with that, because I'm representing a whole lot of taxpayers who gave their consent to this overall structure when they've been paying their utility bills and paying into a fund that was supposed to get them something. I'm representing the generators who gave their consent to this process when they gave their political assent to the laws that impose this burden on them. And they also entered into these contracts. When they turn all this ratepayer money over to y'all, they were supposed to get something in return. Now, my point is, you talk about this as a pay-as-you-go system. We've been going pretty far down the road. We ain't got nowhere yet. So one question I ask along those lines, what do we do to reimburse those folks who paid for some if we decide to abandon Yucca? What do we do to the ratepayers and the generators who've extracted the money for that solution? What's going to happen to those how are they going to be made whole if we decide to go in another direction?
The 1 mil per kilowatt hour is to remove fuel from those sites, put it under federal control, where then the federal government has the responsibility.
That's what we go supposed to go with money hadn't been collected yet. What
No,
about
but I'm
the
saying,
money that's already been collected?
And yeah, sure, but the
It's a big. You say sure, but it's a
each
big
kilowatt hour will ultimately bear a cost, which is currently best estimate of a mil, to manage the disposal. There is no backing away from the federal commitment to manage that process.
My question: what about the stranded asset of the investment that ratepayers have been paying for years now? If it's determined that that asset is going to be abandoned, how about covering their loss?
The federal government administration remains committed to moving that fuel as soon as possible. That's why we believe that this dual track strategy is the fastest way.
But if you're moving it to someplace other than what's been bought and paid for, you're going to add the costs of this other repository system, either this intermediate and permanent or this new permanent. My point is, how do we compensate the folks who paid for the facility we're going to be walking away from if that is what we decide to do?
The estimate remains that the 1 mil per kilowatt hour is a very credible expectation for the cost of getting that fuel accepted and moved.
That's future revenues for future projects. I'm talking about what you're going to do about the issue.
All of it, all the way from the beginning, the current waste fund with its nearly $30 billion sitting in there.
How about the money that's been collected but hadn't been spent yet? What are we going to do about that?
Well, currently it's collecting interest, and it's sitting there to be deployed. In fact, then the request for legislation would be to determine how a new waste organization has access to whatever combination of discretionary and mandatory funds required. But that $30 billion, roughly, or almost $30 billion, is there for this purpose.
Well, I can speak for every county commissioner and city councilman who's got any zoning authority anywhere in the country that there's a problem here that I recognize a mile away. And it's not, again, you didn't invent this problem, but if you got to zone a socially necessary use into an area that's got some controversy or some undesirable effects, you're going to have some problems with folks who don't want it in their backyard. And the problem with a consent-based basis that we're talking about here, one challenge that I see just as an old county commissioner is you got folks who got different ideas about what their backyard is. You might have a local government, a local community just dying to get the jobs and the infrastructure and the opportunity, but you got a state government that don't want it in their backyard. Or you might have a state government that wants it, but a local government don't want it in their backyard. Or you might have the state and the local government on the same page. You got some interest group somewhere that says regards the whole country as their backyard or the planet as their backyard. So I don't want us to be looking for something that's never been found and won't be found. I don't want us to be looking for a unicorn in this picture. Thank you for your
I thank my colleague from Georgia, and I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, great to see you again, and thanks for coming to Pittsburgh this week.
Thank you.
One of the comments that was made in that roundtable you had was an energy company leader said it was important to have regulations that were science-based and enforced consistently so that they could predict our future. I worry about a consent-based approach because I'm not always sure that it's based in science. I'm not sure that, I believe that pure science is best done without politics, and unfortunately politics is often done without science. And we had some hearings prior to today where we learned the story of what happened when a new director of NRC came in, basically shut down the facility, got rid of employees, disposed of records, and set us back in time. And it concerns me that that was politically driven and not scientifically driven. Now, help us, as I appreciate your commitment to wanting to move forward in this, but in March, Nye County, California, last year, they notified DOE of their consent to have repository Yucca Mountain. DOE responded saying that Nevada doesn't consent. And Mr. Secretary, your testimony refers to reports that a number of communities are exploring the possibility of hosting a consolidated storage facility. And NRC staff has indicated 4 entities have expressed some level of interest. Has DOE or the representatives met with these entities? Can you give me a yes or no on that?
No, we are not, and we don't have the authorities to begin any kind of negotiation with these communities.
So isn't it fair that DOE meet with representatives from Nye County, Pennsylvania, or someone else? If you're going to use a consent-based
I'm
approach?
sorry. I believe some other officials have met with people from Nye County.
But people within DOE are not?
I'm sorry?
But people from DOE are not meeting with folks from these other communities?
Again, it's my understanding. I can clarify this later. It's my understanding that certainly some members of the Nuclear Energy Office have had discussions, but nothing that I would call certainly a negotiation. We have no authorities to do.
Well, regarding the interested entities, these 4 that were mentioned, have the senators and governors of the states where they're located endorsed hosting a consolidated interim storage facility? Any of them?
No, sir, as far as my knowledge goes, but earlier, as Mr. Barton said, there's an example where a county in Texas has a public resolution of interest and he said are engaged in discussions with the governor and the state legislature. So that's an example where it's beginning, and that's all. I think until we have a process in place.
Well, let me ask about this process. Have you done any analysis on the adequacy of the Nuclear Waste Fund to pay for both interim storage and final disposal facilities, assuming a fund could be used for both purposes?
Again, the waste adequacy assessment looks at multiple scenarios and finds that there's a very wide range of life cycle costs. The 1 mil per kilowatt.
My point is using the Nuclear Waste Fund to pay for interim and final disposal facilities.
That's again something that will have to be decided in Congress.
But is that something you would support?
The Blue Ribbon Commission supported it.
Okay. And most of DOE's current nuclear waste management activities rely on taxpayer-funded appropriated in 2012 and under the Continuing Resolution 2013. This means the taxpayers are currently funding the cost of DOE's efforts to start over, breaking the historic principle that the beneficiaries of electricity, the consumers, pay the cost of disposal. So for how long and for what cost does the administration support continuing the policy of having the taxpayers foot the bill? Is that part of your discussion?
Again, that's a very important part of the Congress's discussion in terms of how it has chosen to do appropriations, discretionary appropriations, or waste fund allocations.
Sure. Well, in that context, so our concern is we've already spent $15 billion that we appropriated, and then someone for consent reasons or political reasons decided to pull the plug on that. So our concern is if we put more money into this, we want to know there's a commitment from you and Department of Energy to move forward. I was impressed with the article you wrote in Foreign Affairs 2011, where you talked about the importance of nuclear power, and you also acknowledge the sensitivity you have to the government paying billions in damages to energy companies, and that the uncertainty of cost is a big problem with building more nuclear power plants. So in this context, you see the uncertainty of cost remains if we're ambiguous of where we're moving forward. So your commitment to move forward is so important. You mentioned the Blue Ribbons Committee with regard to moving forward, and you also said that we're in a stalemate and we have to be moving the ball forward. You said that today. So help this committee understand or build confidence in DOE's commitment to move forward on using either Yucca Mountain as a permanent storage facility or in what you've also talked about, a temporary one that would maybe for the next 100 years. There's land out there to do that as well. Are you committed to continue to move forward personally on this as the department, or are we going to see more holdups in this process?
Certainly I'm committed. In fact, that's why I'm here today. The administration is committed. The department is committed. Of course, there is this recommendation about a new organization to be formed, and if that is done, then presumably a lot of those responsibilities would novate to this new organization. But I think the point is the administration and the government must be committed to executing this responsibility.
Well, we've been committed to a plan so far, and it's frustrating to have the
rug pulled out.
Gentleman's time
Thank you.
expired. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding a hearing on this important issue, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us once again. I commend your work with the Blue Ribbon Commission, and I appreciate the Department of Energy's continued work on this matter. The administration's strategy for the management and disposal of used nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste makes significant contributions to this debate, and I look forward to continuing this open dialogue with you on how best to address the safety deposit of our country's nuclear waste. My district is Sacramento. The Sacramento Municipal Utility District, otherwise known as SMUD, owns the decommissioned Rancho Seco nuclear power plant, so I have been interested in issues with spent fuel management posed by permanently shut down reactors for some time. I was heartened to see that the administration's strategy includes a pilot interim storage facility with an initial focus on moving fuel from shut down reactors. Shut down reactors represent a unique component in our overall nuclear waste policy. As is the case with SMUD, removal of the spent fuel is many times the last major hurdle in the way of putting the land to a more beneficial use. The Blue Ribbon Commission and the administration both advocate that it should be a priority to move spent fuel from sites with permanently shut down reactors and without an operating nuclear generating station. Do you agree that spent fuel from these sites should be prioritized?
That is certainly the administration's strategy's position.
I strongly support a pilot interim storage facility that removes all spent fuel from permanently shut down sites. It seems to me that a successful pilot project could help repair public confidence in the government's ability to manage the nation's nuclear waste. Do you agree?
Yes.
And what other benefits would a pilot project achieve?
Well, again, well, first and foremost, it would, of course, remove the fuel from those sites. I think it would have, as you've indicated, an enormous impact on saying that there is this commitment to accepting fuel by the federal government. We are accepting fuel. We are moving fuel. We are moving it safely, and I think that would really add a big jolt of confidence to getting this whole program moving. Not talking about it, but moving. Move fuel. That's the issue.
Now, in your testimony, you mentioned that DOE would conduct an analysis of initial use fuel shipments from shut-down reactor sites. Can you elaborate on what specific aspects this analysis will consider?
Well, I think the analysis at this stage has to be quite generic because, of course, what the geography would be of such a pilot facility will determine specific travel routes, et cetera. But I would say, and this is now my own personal speculation, if you like, I think for a first pilot facility, in terms of modal issues, we're probably will be talking, trucking of casks on the highway. As the Academy report many years ago suggested, once we get into a very, very large-scale transportation of thousands of tons per year, then using trains as a major mode will be important.
So it is my understanding that the federal government has been transporting this nuclear waste and spent nuclear fuel in this country for some time now. That's right.
Yes, we've had thousands of shipments.
So can you tell us about that record and whether you're satisfied with the level of safety that has been achieved?
Certainly, my understanding is that there's been a very, very safe record, and as I said, the similar record in Europe, where more than 10 times as many movements have occurred, has also been very good. At least that was the case a few years ago when I was on that Academy committee. To be honest, I haven't looked personally in the last 5 or 6 years.
Okay, well, I believe moving spent nuclear fuel from decommissioned sites first should be a priority, and that a pilot interim storage facility is a necessary step in the right direction in the overall management of our nation's nuclear waste. And I do look forward to working with you, Mr. Secretary, and my colleagues on this committee to make real progress in this area, and I thank you very much.
With the gentlelady, can I have your last 35 seconds?
Yes, you may.
Mr. Secretary, what is a crystalline formation? The rock?
Granite, for example?
And wasn't that exempted under the 87 amendments to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act?
As I recall, I believe that.
And there are 25 states that have this formation?
I didn't.
So if we go to, obviously, a second repository, those sites, based upon your testimony, or those states would still be then open and accessible for granite formations storing high-level nuclear waste. Wouldn't that be correct?
Well, I think, again, that would be...
States like Washington, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia all could be considered.
Wide, I mean, as has been demonstrated internationally, there's a wide range of geologies that can be suitable for a repository.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Chair now recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Secretary. Thank you for going to Morgantown to visit the
it was fun.
National Energy Technology Laboratory. I wasn't here in Congress in 8, 9. I didn't come till 11, so I'm trying to get up to speed with all this debate that's taking place. But I do have a report that was, or an issue, fact-finding from the Nuclear Energy Institute that indicates that in 2008 there were some 3,000 scientists across 5 laboratories and various major universities were involved in filing this application with the DOE for the permit. And then within a year's time, that permit was reversed, or the application was reversed. Mr. Secretary, other than an election taking place during that period of time, what happened? Was there a change in science or technology that the DOE hadn't taken into consideration, or was this decision to cancel the application merely political?
Well, in a similar vein, of course, I was not here as well. However, I would note that, as we've stressed, that there are 2 essential conditions in our view. I mean, one is good science, and number 2 is consent.
That's what I'm saying. What science changed between 08 and 09?
There are 2 issues, science and consent, and the administration felt that on the consent basis, this was simply not a workable project.
Was consent part of the law in 08?
It's a question of the ground truth and the reality. Is the project moving forward? Does the project have the ability to capture all the permits it needs, which include state permits? And so the project was deemed and declared not workable.
Mr. It just you know, engineers or contractors, there's a feel. It feels political. It doesn't feel like it has anything to do with science or technology. The question you were asked several times now. Gentleman from Georgia was asking it. I heard the chairman Upton from Michigan raising the same question. That using his numbers, because I don't know what they are for West Virginia, but when he said Michigan has invested 600, they've taken away from the taxpayers and businesses, everyone using the power, they've extracted $600 million from the residents of Michigan to pay for this facility. What have they gotten for that $600 million?
Well, first of all, of course,
and I heard your answer. It was really, well, that was the amount that's being extracted is fair. It will pay for the facility, but that's not the answer that I think that the question they were asking. What did we get for it? If we wind up ultimately abandoning the facility, what did they get for $600 million in Michigan?
The 1 mil per kilowatt hour has been paid in the rate base for all nuclear utilities for the federal government commitment to accept the fuel and move it from those sites. That commitment remains.
But they've spent $600 million and it hasn't happened yet. So what happens with the amount of money that's already been expended? Are we going to refund it to the individuals? If we abandon, go to a different site? Because I believe you're trying to answer a question. If I can put words in your mouth, that whenever the site is determined, that mil per kilowatt hour will be adequate to be able to facilitate this. But that's not the question. The question is, what happens to the $600 million in Michigan that's already been expended? They don't have anything. There's nothing to show for it.
Again, the 1 mil per kilowatt hour is not to buy a facility, it's to buy a service. The service, as far as the utility is concerned, is spent fuel removal. The failure to begin removing that fuel
which was done
on February 1st, 1998, has led to the payment of damages. Those damages are currently projected to go north of $20 billion back to the utilities because the service is not being provided. The service will be provided. That remains the commitment. And the funds, in the meantime, are, as I said earlier, accruing interest. In fact, I think in the current waste fund, I may be not quite right on this, but I think something like $6 billion of it is interest that has accrued over the time. So it's a service being purchased. That was a decision a long time ago by this Congress in terms of how nuclear waste disposal would be paid for. The commitment remains. It's no different.
In closing, I know my time's over. Are you telling me that if this decision goes in our favor, or it goes in the favor of Yucca Mountain, and all the investment we've made, will the president uphold that, or is this going to be another like DOMA immigration and the employer mandate? Will he enforce this, or will he waive this?
We have made very clear we follow the law. If the court
but he hasn't followed the law. That's the problem. He hasn't followed the law in other cases.
The law will be determined by this court decision that we are all awaiting. And if it directs the NRC to pick up the license, we will do our job to support that, given appropriations. It will be up to the funds to be supplied from discretionary or mandatory by this body, and there will be many other conditions that have to be met, including by the government, land withdrawals, there will be state permits, many, many issues, and again, the judgment remains when you put all of this together. It doesn't seem very workable.
Chairman, I apologize for running.
No, you did fine. Thank you. The gentleman yields back his time. And Secretary, you've been great. We've got one more member here who's actually the chairman of the Energy and Air Quality Committee, so he does have part of the big nuclear portfolio up here, and I'm glad that he stayed around, and I'd like to recognize him for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Shimkus.
I'm aware of his portfolio.
Oh, Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your being with us today, and I just have to say honestly that I don't envy you trying to defend the administration on this issue. I was reading the testimony, and it said the administration supports working with Congress to develop a consent-based process that is transparent, adoptive, and technically sound. And it's my argument that we already have the law on the books. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act. 1982, 1987. Democrats and Republicans made the decision to do it. And now this administration in 2009 made the decision to pull the plug after the Department of Energy had submitted its application in 2008 at the NRC. And then Mr. Jasko, so in my view, Harry Reid, President Barack Obama, and the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission basically made the decision. They don't care what the Congress thinks. They don't think what the American people thinks. They're not going to abide by the Nuclear Policy Act, Waste Policy Act. And as a result, we spent, I've heard different figures. Mr. Barton said around $15 billion, $13 billion, $14 billion for Yucca Mountain. And no one talked about the judgments against the federal government as a result of the lawsuits because the federal government had to breach its contract because it didn't have the ability to take possession of the waste. So that's another $12 or $13 billion. And then the president decides, well, okay, we're going to pull the plug, but we'll establish a blue ribbon commission. And now you all are asking for $1.3 billion and pay as you go, another $5.6 billion over 10 years. And you know, maybe I'm biased, but when I go to the Rotary Club and I talk about this kind of waste, it's really upsetting to people when you talk about a $16 trillion federal debt that's growing every day. And this judgment is growing every day. And so you really do wonder, what is the president thinking about? We have a federal law that has not been invalidated. And the only reason we're now waiting for a decision of the courts is because the administration didn't act. So a lawsuit was filed. And so here we are. And that's, I mean, I have great admiration for you and your intellectual ability and your understanding of the issue. But I tell you, I think that Barack Obama is flat wrong on this issue and that the American people are going to suffer. Now, maybe that's my opening statement, and I'd be happy to give you an opportunity to respond if you want to. I'm certainly not frustrated in any way, but if you'd like to respond, fine. If you...
Well, again, just it would be repetitive that Secretary Chu felt that the project would be unworkable, and that's, again, based on the issue of public acceptance, which we consider to be equally important as the scientific criterion. So, again, as I said earlier, when the judgment is made in the litigation with the NRC, I think we'll have a path forward there, whichever it is. But again, I think I've come here today to especially to try to present my perspective. It's the one of the Blue Ribbon Commission that we need to pursue these two tracks in any event. It will be our fastest approach to move fuel, to accept fuel, and we believe that's needed no matter what the repository pathway is. And I hope that we can work together to move the ball.
And I would just say that, I mean, the President's out there every day talking about all the above, and the nuclear energy is really being stagnant right now because of this waste issue. And if he's genuinely concerned about carbon emissions, he should get off the dime and take some action to expedite this waste issue, taking care of this waste issue, or we're going to have a pretty stagnant nuclear energy in the U.S., in my view.
If I may respond to that, I think the administration's actions are very consistent on nuclear power with the all of the above strategy. The fact is, after many years of talk, this administration moved out with the conditional $8 billion loan guarantee for first mover nuclear plant construction in Georgia, AP 1000s. This administration launched the program to and already decided on one license for a new small modular reactor to be constructed. And the administration feels that it's putting forward, in fact, the proposal for the most effective way to address waste management in a consent-based approach. So I think the ground truth, the ground facts speak for themselves.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I might make one final comment. Every day the President, when he talks about energy, he talks about all of the above, and yet America is the only country in the world where you cannot build a new coal-powered plant. So I don't see how he can say all of the above.
Well, I'd like to respond to that as well. In a similar vein, I think, first of all, of course, the President has stated, and I've stated, and thousands and thousands of scientists have stated, that it would be imprudent not to start addressing the greenhouse gas emission issue. So so that's kind of a given in the administration's position. Now, given that, what does all the above mean? What it means in this case is, and I'm going to go back and say, there was a lot of talk in the talk for many years. This administration put $6 billion on the table for clean coal projects, 8 major sequestration projects. 1 has started, 2 will start next year, 5 are in construction. The administration, ARPA-E, has invested in more than 20 projects for novel capture technologies. So if we're going to establish carbon capture utilization, and I might add 6 of those 8 projects have enhanced oil recovery as part of it. If we're going to establish the competitiveness of all of our resources in a low carbon world, this is exactly what we need to do, and the President moved out on these programs.
Well, I do hope, if I may make one final comment, I do hope that you would consider things other than just carbon capture and sequestration, because there's a lot of other technology out there that can be just as beneficial.
Well, in fact, if I may add, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, one last thing.
You've been very kind on all this time you've given, so of course you can continue.
So another example in this case was a week after the President's climate plan announcement at Georgetown, our department put out a draft solicitation for an $8 billion loan guarantee program for advanced fossil technologies across the board. We're waiting for input in September, but we said as examples, it could be dry fracking, it could be new carbon utilization technologies, it could be advanced fossil combined heat and power. So we're putting out the programs to establish fossil fuels as part of the low-carbon future.
And reclaiming my time, and want to thank the Secretary for your time. And it was good for some of my nuclear friends to hear some fossil fuel coal stuff. So that's why I definitely am all the above in my congressional district. So it was probably good for them to hear some of that. In conclusion, again, I'd like to thank you. You spent a wonderful amount of time and in a subcommittee setting, which it is fairly unique in this process. I want to thank my members on both sides who participate in today's hearings, and I want to remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask you, Mr. Secretary, to respond to those as promptly as you can.
Yes.
And with that, the hearing is now adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Tunko.